Biological membranes are an arrangement of phospholipids that gather together to enclose a volume. So those membranes act as a barrier separating the outside environment from that enclosed volume. So you'll recall that a phospholipid has a hydrophilic end and a hydrophobic end. That means that they're amphiphilic. When phospholipids arrange to form a membrane barrier, both the inside and the outside of the membrane include water. So there's water here and there's water here. And this part here is the membrane. So there's water on the outside and water on the inside. The phospholipids do not form a single line, but instead form two parallel lines with their hydrophobic ends in between. They form a phospholipid bilayer. So let's take a look at this diagram here. You can see that there is a line or a row of those phospholipids here and another layer of them here. And then their hydrophobic ends are here in the middle. And this is the bilayer.
Selective permeability. So these membranes that are formed allow for the intake of nutrients and the elimination of waste because they are selectively permeable. Permeable just means being able to pass. And if you're selectively permeable, it means that you select which things are allowed to pass and which are not allowed to pass. So this means that they can let some molecules pass through and not others. And this maintains a separate internal environment. So let's take a look at this image here. If this is the external environment and this is the internal environment, you can see that not all of these molecules are allowed to pass through. Only some are allowed to pass through the membrane. And so out here, we have only these molecules, while on the outside, there are various molecules.
The formation of a cell membrane, also called plasma membrane, was one of the first steps in the evolution of cells. The membrane separated the inside world and the outside world, but still allowed for the intake of nutrients and the elimination of wastes. Regulating the amount of each nutrient and waste crossing the membrane is part of maintaining homeostasis. Homeostasis describes a state of relative equilibrium of physical and chemical processes within a cell. Early cells were enclosed by simple fatty acid bilayers that allowed few molecules to pass through. Only water and small nonpolar molecules such as oxygen and carbon dioxide pass through fatty acid bilayers. Later cells developed more complex membranes that included proteins. These proteins act as doorways to allow for more molecules to enter and leave the cell. With the help of proteins, larger molecules, polar molecules, and charged ions can cross membranes. Solutions are made up of solutes and solvents. Solutions are homogeneous mixtures of two or more pure substances. The solute is dissolved in the solvent. Solvents are usually liquids, but can also be gases or solids. Commonly, there is more solvent than solute. In biological systems, the most common solvent is water. And so here we see the solvent water and this solute, which appears to be sugar or salt. Membrane transport. Aqueous solutions are typically found on both sides of any cell membrane, internal or external. Membrane transport involves the movement of solutes or water across a cell membrane. Cells maintain homeostasis and do cellular work with membrane transport. We will learn about passive transport, which requires no input of free energy, and active transport, which does require an input of free energy. Passive transport is the movement of molecules and ions, or solutes and water, through a cell membrane without the input of free energy. It occurs where the concentration of a substance is greater on one side of the membrane than on the other. This is known as moving with the concentration gradient. There are three types of passive transport: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. Diffusion. Diffusion is the first type of active transport that we're going to talk about. And diffusion is the random movement of particles in gas or liquid from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Particles move randomly in all directions, but if there's an uneven distribution of particles in solution, then over time the particles naturally spread out and become evenly distributed. A large drop of blue dye was dropped into a container of water, and after a couple of seconds it looked like this. And here you can see some areas of high concentration, and then also some areas that are more that are not quite as concentrated. These are areas of low concentration. So over time, these particles here are naturally going to spread out and become evenly distributed throughout this water. If you spray a strong perfume in one corner of the classroom, it will have a strong smell in that corner, but students on the other side of the classroom won't be able to smell it. Over time, the perfume molecules will diffuse to the rest of the classroom. There is now more room for the same number of particles, so each particle has more places it can be. This is another way of saying that the entropy of the perfume room system has increased. No energy is required for this to occur.
So here we have a membrane layer. Remember, membranes often act as the barrier between the areas of high and low concentrations in a solute. Solute molecules diffuse in all directions, but the net movement is from the areas of the highest concentration to the areas of the low concentration. So molecules that are allowed to cross a membrane will diffuse until their concentration is at equilibrium, equal on both sides of the membrane. So let's take a look here. Here you have a high concentration of a molecule that is allowed to pass through this cell membrane. And over time, some of those molecules begin to come and pass through the cell membrane. And eventually you will find that you have an equal amount on both sides, and that is referring to this equilibrium. So any molecule that's allowed to cross this membrane will diffuse until their concentration is at equilibrium.
O2 and CO2 molecules are small enough to cross the lipid bilayer membrane by diffusion. The green dots here and all around here and inside the membrane here represent O2 molecules. No energy is required to move them from the outside to the inside of the membrane, as the O2 concentration is greater here on the outside than it is on the outside. The molecules follow the concentration gradient from high to low. And so, because there's a higher concentration of O2 molecules here on the outside, some will diffuse to the inside of the membrane. Concentration gradients of different solutes are independent of each other. Each type of molecule moves along its own concentration gradient. Some may diffuse into the cell, others may diffuse out. Diffusion is a spontaneous process, and each type of molecule diffuses at its own rate. So osmosis is the third type of passive transport that we're going to talk about. And osmosis is the net diffusion or flow of water molecules through a semi-permeable membrane into an area of higher solute concentration. This difference in concentration is called the concentration gradient. The net flow of water molecules will go to zero when the solute concentration is the same on both sides of the membrane. Even though the net flow is in one direction or the other or zero, Individual molecules of water will continue to move in both directions. Osmosis is a type of passive transport. It requires no energy. This might be a little confusing. Why are we talking about the movement of water based on the concentration of the solute? Why not just talk about the solute moving through the membrane? Because of the semi-permeable membrane. This membrane does not allow the passage of the solute. The water molecules diffuse through the membrane. The solute molecules do not. Osmosis applies to the movement of a solvent, water, based on the concentration of the solute. Water is polar, therefore it cannot easily cross this non-polar lipid bilayer, even if it is a small molecule. So biological membranes have these aquaporins. These are protein water channels that allow the diffusion of water molecules across the membrane. Aquaporins are highly specific. They exclude other molecules. These alpha helices of the aquaporins create a hydrophilic water channel, so this water can pass through the cell membrane.